I would like to welcome all of you to the Arab American Culture and Community Center. This center has been established in 1995. Many of the founders are here, and then after that, money was collected to build this beautiful room, and last year it was paid off. So I'd like to greet all of you and appreciate all the work that has been done by the community. And I would like to thank Faiza, who is the president now, Dr. Faiza, she's outside, for accepting this invitation to co-sponsor this important event. I would like to thank all of you also for coming on a Sunday afternoon, which is normally people spend with their families, and the weather is not nice outside. So I know that this is a debate, a conversation, an intellectual involvement and engagement. And so I'm glad there is a group of intellectuals from our community like you who are here. Professor Al Azmeh is in Houston. He was invited by the Arab American Educational Foundation chairs at Rice and in the University of Houston. This is a crucially important symposium that was held both one day at Rice and one day at Houston. And this is a great collaboration that the foundation has ignited between the two universities to establish some new cultural paradigm. And they invited people from all around the world to talk about not sectarianism, but about anti-sectarian traditions in the Arab world. Because people keep talking about sectarianism, but we really have some great anti-sectarian traditions that we need to revive and dissect and build on them to get out of this deadlock. So I would like to thank Professor Maqdisi and Professor Takriti for working very diligently over the last months to bring so many great speakers and to bring Professor Al Azmeh to speak about so many important issues. I have enjoyed attending some of these lectures, and some of you have attended the keynote speech about 2 days ago that has highlighted very important issues in the intellectual culture of the Arab world. So please give a big applause to Dr. Takriti and Dr. Maqdisi. So this is what, when you have a good community that's supportive of intellectual and cultural endeavors like this, you produce a lot of activities, and we are proud that this feature is now unique to Houston when you have two chairs that are collaborating and have many graduate students. And we are on our way to establish a Center for Arab Studies in the University of Houston. So I may get back to you in the next few months to update you about the process and to ask for your help. Professor Al Azmeh does not need an introduction. Most of you who follow up on the literature in Arabic and English about the current affairs in the Middle East, whether about fundamentalism or about extremism, about state building, about modernities, you'll find Dr. Al Azmeh's name in the literature. Dr. Aziz Al Azmeh, and Allah يعينكم كأنه عزيز واحد لا يكفي على هذه البوديوم to create troubles. So Dr. Al Azmeh was born in Damascus in 1947, and Al Azmeh's family is very well known. Yusuf Al Azmeh, of course, you all know, the one who challenged the French invasion في حكومة الملك فيصل in 1920, when the government decided not to fight the French invasion of Damascus. Aziz Al Azmeh كان وزير الحربية, and Yusuf Al Azmeh كان وزير الحربية, and he said, I'm going to do it. I know we're not going to win this battle, but we don't want someone in the future say that the French entered Damascus without resistance. So Yusuf Al Azmeh has established a history that a lot has been written about Yusuf Al Azmeh. Nabih Al Azmeh, the grandfather of Aziz, was prime minister twice between 48 and 54. Also, he was exiled to Jerusalem. Apparently, he was also a troublemaker. So he was exiled to Jerusalem when he established the Palestinian Solidarity Committee that basically has a good history of building a resistance between Palestinians and the Syrians. And there are many other people from this family who served their country very well, and therefore it's not a surprise that Dr. Aziz comes from that aristocratic family with national and patriotic traditions. Dr. Al Azmeh then went to Beirut, finished high school and college, and then Germany, and then he ended up in Oxford when he did his PhD in the Oriental Studies, Islamic Studies. And since the 80s, Dr. Al Azmeh has been going through different countries, teaching and writing. And he wrote about many topics from Ibn Khaldun to Ibn Taymiyyah, Mas'udi, Tirmidhi, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. And then he got interested through that in more fundamental issues about modernism and Islam. His book, Modernities, Islams, not Islam, Islams and Modernities, is a book that has been very widely recognized and used as a reference by many people. Many of his books are in Arabic and translated to English or the other way around. I think the most recent book I have seen is Syria, The Ascendance of Fundamentalism, الصعود الأصولي في سوريا. Basically, he built very good arguments that's based on his previous elaboration on the appearance of fundamentalism in Syria and its relationship with sectarianism. He has his own views about the relationship between these are not identical phenomena. And he discussed many historical and ideological issues. Dr. Al Azmeh allowed me to invite him to here, which is a great honor, and I'm very thrilled that he agreed to do this. And he allowed me to use the language that I want, because he is very versed in Arabic and English. And I'm going to run this in English, but every now and then if someone wants to ask a question in Arabic, we'll have no problem with that. Dr. Al Azmeh also gave me a full freedom to ask any questions, and I know he is very versed in a wide spectrum of issues. So we are going to maybe, I don't want this to be a very restricted academic endeavor, and then we lose many of you. But also I don't want to be very scattered, and so people ask questions from Andalus to Indonesia. So probably we'll try to have some focus. And maybe we'll try to relate this discussion about fundamentalism, about Islamism, about liberation, about building a state, about sectarianism, try to connect it with the current deadlock in the Arab countries and the violence. And then whether this, what you see now, the violence is because of the failure of an intellectual Arab project, or both the failure of project and the violence are due to a more deeply rooted socio-economic issues. What is the role of the external factor in all this? So that's how we really benefit from studying history. History is different from the past. History is about the future, is about the present. The past is, anyone can write about the past, small khatara or shi'r or memory. But history is a field that will enable you to make the connections between things and use it to live the present and to basically look forward to a future that has benefited from the history. And people who don't use history as a lesson, then they reduce history to the past. يختزلون التاريخ إلى الماضي. Therefore, we're going to use these great minds in history. We're going also to have, if you have questions also, you know, Professor Maqdisi is an expert in sectarianism. He has written a lot about it. Professor Tikriti, he has recently finished a very nice website about Palestinian revolution, and that also projected into the history in the past and intellectual history of the revolution. Professor Abul Ula is interested in literature, but also he has projected in some of his works in the past about revolution, about ideology and literature. And what we are witnessing now in Syria and in Iraq and the Middle East really challenges everyone. I mean, it is a very big challenge, and having you here to share some of your thoughts about how to get out of this, to have someone like Professor Al Azmeh, is hopefully will make some step forward toward understanding, deciphering these difficult situations. This is not going to be a political science endeavor or a journalistic thing. This is history. And so therefore your questions should be tailored toward that history. What the format will be, basically, I'm going to ask Professor Al Azmeh several things, maybe for 20, 30 minutes, and then open the floor for discussion. And I was talking yesterday about some of the attendees of this symposium that the failure that we are seeing now in the Arabic countries, it affects both the Islamist ideology and secular ideology. Both of them have failed to bring our countries to a safe harbor. And basically, both the right and the left. Because in the right, there's nothing right, and in the left, there's nothing left. So basically, we are very bankrupt, and we try to get out of this miserable and desperate situation. I'm going to give you a brief idea about coverage, because we are going to mention some terms. So some of you, if you don't capture them, maybe you get lost. So, and many of you have asked me, just for the sake of it, to make an introduction about this for a minute or two in Arabic. And I won't mind. I don't think I've forgotten my Arabic language. I'm not going to speak in Iraqi dialect, so I'm going to speak in an understandable language. So منذ نهاية الحكم العثماني ولربما قبله بقليل، يعني في أواخر القرن التاسع عشر، الفكر العربي الحديث تلاقفته مدرستان. وأقول تلاقفته ولم أقول شغلته عن عمد. تلاقفته فكرتان. تلك الفكرتين كانت ذو نزعتين مختلفتين. النزعة الأولى هي الإسلام هو الحل. الإسلام يمتلك حلول وتفسيرات لكل مظاهر الكون والطبيعة والمجتمع. وبسبب ابتعادنا عن الإسلام حلت بنا المصائب من كل صوب وحد. هذه فكرة بدت من زمن النهضة. الرشيد رضا بداها، محمد عبده أخذ منحى آخر بالنهضة، ولكن الجميع حتى في زمن النهضة أغلب الكتاب حاولوا أن يستعيدوا الفكر القويم من خلال الرجوع إلى الدين وليست من خلال الخروج عنه. واستمرت هذه إلى حسن البنا. وهناك هاي المدرسة قسم من الناس يقول، بالمناسبة ما سوف أطرحه من آراء وأسئلة لا تعبر عن وجهة نظري إنما فقط لغرض الحديث. فقسم من يقول أنه هكذا التيار الإسلامي من حسن البنا إلى أبو بكر البغدادي لم نشهد منه غير العنف والمصائب. المدرسة الثانية هي المدرسة العلمانية التي كانت تقول أنه الغرب انتصر بعد أن انفصلت الكنيسة عن الدولة، ولا بد سوف لم يكون لنا مستقبلا بدون فصل هذين الاثنين. وسوف نتطرق إلى العلمانية وتعريفاتها وكيف ممكن أن نحل هالعلاقة بين الدين والدولة التي تفسد الاثنين. العلمانية في الغرب تقدمت، وقسم يقول أن العلمانية لا تصلح لنا لأن احنا لا يوجد لدينا تاريخ كنيسة، إنما لدينا تجربة عبرت إلى الأندلس والصين وحلت مشاكل العالم وأصبحت مركز الكون، فلماذا لا نرجع لها؟ فالدكتور عزيز راح يوضح بعض الإشكاليات في هذه المنحى. فإذا I'm sorry. So therefore أنا استرسلت أكثر من اللازم بالعربي. I'm very sorry. So we're going basically to dissect these two schools of thinking throughout the Arab world over the last 100 years. And of course, every school branched out to different schools. Some of them adopted violence as a way to solve our problems. And some of them have totally melted with the liberal thoughts. And so all our problems can be solved by importing the exact Western system from America or from Europe, and that would be the only solution for us. So all these difficult issues, we need to understand them to know what is the alternative. What system do we need? How can we tackle this problem? And is this problem a manifestation of a deeper problem that we need to address? Is it a matter of just changing text and writing things, or there are some more problems? So I'm going to start asking Professor Al Azmeh some questions. Each one will take maybe a few minutes to answer. And then from that, we are going to proceed to the current situation that we see in Syria and Iraq and how this situation has culminated, as he sheds light on that in his book about الصعود الأصولية في Syria. So Professor Al Azmeh, I would like to thank you again for accepting this invitation. It's really an honor. In the year 2000, there was a small booklet called العلمانية تحت المجهر. That was a debate between Professor Al Azmeh and Professor Abdul Wahab al-Mseri. If you remember, Dr. Abdul Wahab, we brought him here when he was in MD Anderson, and we brought him here on this podium and discussed issues with him. He was not in a good mood. He was treated But Abdul Wahab Mseri represents the other side of the story. He was very deep intellectual, but he represented a different spectrum. And this book, I encourage you to get in the PDF file, is available. Al-Ilmaniyya Taht al-Mijhar, they both dissects both sides of the argument beautifully, very deep. So, Professor Al Azmeh, I would like to thank you again. And the first question is about the terminology. Al-Ilmaniyya is a term that many people don't know how it came about. Some people think Al-Ilmaniyya, it comes from Al-Ilm, means you look at things scientifically. And some people say it is Al-Almaniyya, which is different. And some people call it Ad-Dunyawiyya instead of Ilmaniyya, because شؤون dunya, يعني أنتم أعلم بشؤون دنياكم. If you please don't mind, just explain the term Al-Ilmaniyya and why there is some sensitivity in the street of the Arab world now about Ilmaniyya, and it is always considered to be parallel to corruption, atheism, bad taste, imported ideas, and many people have replaced it in Egypt, for example, بالمدنية, الدولة المدنية instead الدولة العلمانية. They say, let's talk about democracy instead of talking about Ilmaniyya. So what is the historical origin of this term, and why there's such a fear of this term in the Arab world?
Yes, thank you very much indeed. I am deeply honored by this invitation. Thank you all for being here to listen to this what I hope to be a very productive discussion. If I may say a couple of things before we come to the question of Ilmaniyya, Almaniyya, and so forth. Thank you very much for mentioning Yusuf Al Azmeh, who was my great uncle. I often recall his name in two contexts. One, of course, is that he is a heroic figure, and all movements of national liberation, nation building, and so forth require heroic figures. Of course, not all of us can be heroic. Some people deride heroes as being somewhat also foolish, that is to say, allowing themselves to be obliterated, but then they do get themselves obliterated. Of course, the logic of judgment here is an entirely different one to that which might apply to me and to most of us, because these are figures whom we revere and in whom we, in fact, lodge a tremendous symbolic value. So, having had that connection with the Yusuf Al Azmeh is really a source of deep pride to me. The other point that I would mention in the context of Yusuf is that, of course, he also represents an historical trend to which I personally attach myself. Yusuf Al Azmeh was a secularist modernist. He was a secularist modernist, and he did have close connections with Mustafa Kemal. And this is Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. And this is indeed a political, cultural, and developmental tradition which is very dear to me personally, and to which I also attach myself. This is by way of an initial clarification, so that I introduce myself in a manner which will probably shed some light on certain things that I would wish to say. You mentioned Ibn Taymiyyah, and I can't really resist telling you a little anecdote. A few days ago, a friend of mine sent me something which they had found on the web. It was a discussion on an Islamist website commenting on. I have a short book about Ibn Taymiyyah. In fact, it's not a book about Ibn Taymiyyah. It's an anthology of Ibn Taymiyyah with an introduction which is designed to help people understand him, read him in a manner which is appropriately historical. And so one of these protagonists, one of these interlocutors said, I think I have the sense that this man is a secularist. The other response, he said, I can smell Shiism in him and the things that he says. And then he gets the response, yes, not only is he Shia, he's probably also an Iraqi. So this is just to give you an idea of the sort of atmosphere that prevails in the present situation, which causes me a tremendous amount of anguish, I must say, and it is something which actually then encouraged me and engages me and encourages me to speak to wonderful audiences like yourselves and to engage in the sorts of discussions which we are having today. Now, the question of terminology, and then I will have to say something a little bit more about secularism. I am personally indifferent to the way in which the word is spelled. Ilmaniya, almaniya in Arabic. I don't think that what matters is the word from which ilmaniya, almaniya is derived. I'm not particularly concerned with whether the word comes from science or from the world, ilmaniya, almaniya. What is crucial to my understanding of things is that words need to be used in manners which are appropriate to contexts. Now, since the word al-ilmaniya has had a constant presence in the Arabic language, then of course I would like to use the word al-ilmaniya because it has a commonly accepted semantic field, a commonly accepted understanding. Now, in the last 20 years, another version, which is al-almaniya, emerged basically under Egyptian influence, and it emerged basically in the context of anti-secular polemics deriving or arising in Egypt. So this other word is now very much in the public domain. So we are in a situation where both words actually might legitimately be used. Since you proposed that we talk a little bit historically, the word ilmaniya and ilmaniyin, that is to say, as the laity in contrast to the church, is present in medieval Arabic. Ilmaniyin are the laity in medieval church Arabic. So to that extent, since also the word secularism and laicism are related to the division between laity and clergy, then of course there is a certain historical legitimacy to al-ilmaniya. Muhammad Abdu used the word secularism in the form of madaniya. But of course the madaniya at that time is different to the sense in which it is used today. It is used today because people are nervous, actually, of using the word secularism as such. Indeed, I do remember in 1992 I published a book in Arabic entitled Al-Ilmaniya. Some of you may have seen it. The English translation will appear next year, 25 years after the event. But there were serious attempts, actually, to compel the publisher to remove the word Ilmaniya from the title. Didn't work, and I'm very pleased that it did not work, because I really do think that in order to deal with matters of relevance to Arab public life, we need to use appropriate vocabularies and not mince words. I'm not given to mincing words. I'm given to using words appropriately, words that fit a particular phenomenon that we need to describe and talk about and perhaps debate. Right? So in this sense, I'm not particularly enamored of the attempts to use madaniya instead of ilmaniya today, because it is a matter of mincing words. It is a matter of mincing words, and I think also, as a secularist myself, I think it is an unnecessary concession to those who have different views about the relationship between religion, social life, social organization, legal order, politics, state institutions, and so on and so forth. Because this is really the context of secularism. It's not simply a matter of dividing religion from state. There is, in my view, a very strong argument for subjecting religious institutions to forms of state regulation. That is to say, to ensure that religious institutions abide by common laws and are not subject to laws which are outside the province of law as it is normally understood. That is to say, outside the province of civil law. So to that extent, I don't think it has to do with the division of religion from state. You will find that highly secularized states, for instance, France, or Turkey until recently, did in fact have state bureaus whose task it was to regulate religious affairs and to ensure that religious institutions are subject to civil laws, which to my mind really is the ultimate measure of institutional secularism in any given political or national body. Now, one crucial thesis which I like to sustain, and I think it's particularly relevant to any discussion of secularism, is that secularization is not necessarily exclusively an act of will. It's not simply something voluntaristic, something that people dream up and then program and then try to implement. Secularization is, in fact, an objective historical process of which many people might not be aware. And this is why you find that Arab societies, almost all Arab societies, and until recently, until the point was reached when political Islam and social Islamization are starting to acquire center stage in Arab public life, secularization had proceeded as a result and as a consequence of social and cultural changes, which did not, in fact, have an ideological counterpart. That is to say, we have had secularized societies without a secularizing ideology. In fact, very few societies have a secular ideology as an official ideology. This had been the case in France, it had been the case in Turkey, it had been the case in Mexico, it had been the case, of course, in all socialist countries in the Soviet bloc, right? But generally, secularization proceeds in a manner which is not necessarily accompanied by secularizing ideologies. Now, if you look at Europe, you will find that one of the most godless societies is the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is very thoroughly secularized. The United Kingdom is a country where the rates of religious observance, church attendance, and so forth is extremely low. Yet it is a country which does not have a secular constitution and where the head of state is also the head of the official church. So the two things are really quite distinct. There is no uniform model. The crucial matter, to my mind, is actual social changes. Social change which proceed objectively because since the beginning of the 19th century, with antecedents earlier, we have had a process whereby the whole world was remodeled in a variety of crucial fields. First of all, forms of state administration, forms of official culture and cultural production, for instance, universities, university faculties, university topics and disciplines, sociology, economics, philosophy, and so on and so forth. We've had also internationally the spread of particular kinds of cultural production, such as, for instance, the novel, particular forms of painting, particular forms of music, and so on and so forth. So the history of the world in the last two centuries has seen the overwhelming practical dominance of practices, of administrative forms, of cultural forms, which are in fact at variance with what religious institutions may have wished. Now, what happened in Europe is that societies developed to such an extent that, to a very large extent, religious discourse and religious pronouncements of particular types, for instance, regarding history, regarding the cosmos, and so forth, even regarding the status of canonical texts, of scripture, that is to say, of the Old Testament and of the New Testament, which had been subjected to historical study, society had developed to such an extent that traditional religious discourses were no longer respectable and were no longer accepted by the vast majority of the educated public. And as such, you would see that, of course, religious institutions, particularly Protestant religious institutions, tended to revise the sort of religious output. Now, this brings to my mind the situation in the United States, where you have highly traditionalist, literalist approaches to scripture, which predominate in certain regions, but phenomena of this kind are extremely rare in Europe. The American situation, to my mind, is really quite special, and of course is reflected in the constitutional status of religion in the United States, which is very different to that which prevails in Europe, or in most European countries. Now, just one last point. Why is the street the Arab street? I don't like the street. Street is derisive, really. I mean, it's a derisive way to refer to people. So I don't really like to use it as Shari' al-Arabi.
What do you want to
the wider public. Something rather more neutral, because I really think that the street is derisive. It has a bit of contempt in it, in the way it refers to people people we are very much beloved to Donald Trump, uneducated and so forth. The sensitivity, in actual fact, if those of us who are, let us say, above 40 or 45, will recall that these sensitivities were not present, or were only present to a very small extent. We think we all recognize, those of us who have actually lived through, who lived through the 70s, right, will recognize that the Arab world today is almost unrecognizable if compared to the way it was at that time. Now, this is not I'm not romanticizing a sort of a kind of innocence that we had. I'm simply emphasizing serious change that has overcome our societies, most parts of our societies, including on questions of religion. Now, I would submit that the Islamist trend that you mentioned Rashid Rida, Hassan al-Banna, and then of course you ended up with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. I would submit that these trends, although they existed, and in some cases were well organized, particularly the Egyptian Muslim Brothers, yet they had not reached a point where they came to occupy center stage in public life. Religious terms were used in public output, but they were not central to public output. And I think if we want to look at one of the indices of change in the last 30 years is actually this balance in vocabularies, religious versus secular vocabularies applied to public life and to personal behavior. Just one very simple example: when people, instead of saying aib for a certain type of behavior, say haram, that actually then betokens a change in mood, in points of reference, and so on. And I think that the Arab world, much of it, has actually seen such a transition from a part of the world which had been proceeding at peace with itself and with the social developments that it had come to live through, is now going somewhere else and is no longer at peace with the social developments and the cultural developments that we had accomplished over a period of over 100 years.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Before I came, I Googled, went to YouTube to see exactly what is the prevalent interest of the public in Arabic. So I did click on a lecture about al-Usuliyya fi Syria, and there were 305 clicks. There's another, you see on the side, there are many other YouTubes, and so I clicked on one, said هل أن الجن ذكورا أم أناث. 1.5 million hits. There's another one said استخدام القرآن لعلاج أمراض المعدة والضغط والسكري. There's 1.8 million hits. So I'm not trying to make fun at all on people. This is a level of consciousness that we need to address when we address the phenomena of sectarianism or fundamentalism. Now, the question that comes is, probably if you put a different title for your book, probably it will have marketed very heavily. Maybe you put jinn or uns or something else. But once you put secularism, then basically this is a certain way to lead that publishing house to bankruptcy. So as an original thinker and very well-known authority on discussing issues on fundamentalism and secularism, as Professor Al Azmeh said, that secularism is not only one color. I mean, there's what they call harsh secularism, which considered religion as epistemologically illegitimate. That's one, like in France. Another one, or even Turkey, before 20, 30 years ago, before the current government has consolidated all the power on the person of Erdogan. Soft secularism considered that because we cannot tell exactly where the truth is, then skepticism and tolerance should be the overriding principles in talking about issues like this, more tolerant. So from this, I would like to go to the next question, is that a question very commonly asked in the community that, well, Islam has ruled for more than 1,000 years and has built a brilliant civilization in Baghdad, in Damascus, and in Andalus, and could absorb all the ideas. So the issue is not in the text itself. The issue is how people and how cultures reacted to the text and produce a unique experiment, and that's how it became the center of the world. Some people tell you, no, it's not Islam really. Anything, if comes in the right time, can produce a successful experiment. Like in America, they did not use Islam. In France, they did not use Islam. On the other hand, there are many other countries use Islam, but they are total failures. But is the question is that can a form of secularism be derived in the region that can absorb the Islamic traditions and produce a unique, widely acceptable and successful model?
Thank you. This is an important question, but just one little comment arising from your mention of Jinn al-Afarit and so forth. President al-Bashir of Sudan,
yes,
about 10 years ago, advocated the use of al-Jinn al-Sudani al-Mu'min, that is to say, believing Sudanese jinn in the development of his country. And in fact, the Sudanese parliament at that time came to a resolution whereby the efforts of al-Jinn al-Sudani al-Mu'min was to be used in a 5-year plan. So so it's not just a matter of internet. It's also, it's legislation and popular representation and so forth. Listen, the question of historical material, historical resource, as it were, right? There is a common assumption that our histories in the Arab world are Islamic histories, whereas Europe is characterized by a division between state and church. Now, of course, this is empirically untrue, and that Christianity is distinguished from Islam in dividing religion and politics. And again, that's untrue. If you read the epistles of Paul, you will find some of the most emphatic statements about the necessity of religion to the state, and of the necessity and of the primacy of religion over state authority. So the question, this is manufactured. This came later. This assumption that there was a division came later. And then, of course, even the most superficial view of European histories will find that European royalty, be it in the East and Byzantium or in the West, England, France, Germany, is very intimately connected to religion, whereby the king, in fact, performs the role of Christ in human society and in the regulation of human society and in leading human society to salvation. That is to say, the kingship acquired a clerical character, while at the same time the church acquired a monarchical character, particularly in Rome with the papacy. So please, let's forget about this myth of very distinct itineraries between the Islamic historical experiences of state and the Christian historical experiences of state. They're very well comparable. I have a whole book about this, and the two are really, the incidence of religion to both is equally strong and equally important and equally decisive historically. Now, what happened was that European societies at a particular point in time, following the Reformation, this is an extremely complex and very interesting matter that we can talk about if you wish, arrived at a point where societies acquired a variety of forms of institutional differentiation. That is to say, education, the production of knowledge, the production of culture, the production of law, the making of law, lawmaking, state institutions, the various orders of society. There was a degree of institutional differentiation which also produced the differentiation of religion as a particular sphere, specific to itself, with its own specific configuration. The same thing happened with us, as a matter of fact. Starting from the time of the Ottoman reforms in the 19th century, you will find that the religious institutions were disengaged from two crucial things. The disengagement was never complete. It was never complete in Europe either. The disengagement was tendential and varied from place to place. They were disengaged from the process of lawmaking and law implementation. You will find that in our countries, even where in Syria or in Egypt, where law of personal status is subject to certain religious regulation, but the actual courts are civilian courts. They're not clerical courts. They're not courts of. They're not Sharia courts. They are actually civil courts which implement law, which is made on a basis connected to certain religious antecedents. So the domain of law and the domain of education, that is to say, with the introduction of school systems, particularly state school systems, mainly inspired by the French model, again, the class of ulama was no longer the supplier of education. Of course, there are schools that belong to Al Azhar, to Dar al Fatwa in Beirut, to a variety of churches. Although I must say that church schools, Christian denominational schools tend to be somewhat less religious than Muslim denominational schools run by Al Azhar or what have you. But that's a different question altogether. So in these two crucial domains, there has been actually a disengagement and a relative marginalization of the production of religious knowledge and of the incursion of religious terms and antecedents in the production of law and in the framing of state institutions and state schools. So you will find then that this is what I mean by objective secularization. We are societies in very considerable measure that have been subjected over a period of 150 years to systemic secularization. Now, one consequence of this is that in large measure, religious observance, until recently, and I'm really emphasizing the fact that the last 30 years have seen very, very serious changes in our society, to the extent that religious observance in any parts of our countries except for small communities were no longer, in fact, communal observances, that is to say, communal observances whose task was to perform rituals of social cohesion and of social solidarity. Now, by saying this, I'm also implying that, again, to a large extent, questions of religious belief and practice were, to a large extent, privatized, right? Which, again, is a fundamental feature of the secularization process. So we have been subject to these kinds of differentiations. Arabic culture has not been sufficiently bold to signal these matters explicitly. What it has done is not engage religion in a way which was in any way derisive or hostile or betokening some kind of serious contestation. It has generally ignored it. Ignored it on a number of assumptions. First of all, because it had lost much of its social salience over a long period of time. And secondly, there was the implicit assumption on the part of those who believe in social progress that time will act to diminish the strength and incidence and relevance of religion, that it will somehow disappear. Of course, religions do not disappear. When people speak of a religious revival in the Arab countries, of course, there's quite a lot wrong with this thesis, but one fundamental thing is that religion never disappeared. What is happening in the last 30 years is that religion is being given a different shape and different social functions.
Great, thank you very much. Before we move to the other section, talking about the relationship between fundamentalism and sectarianism, and then the third phase, which is the current upheavals in the Arab world, I would like to bring to the discussion the importance of the interpretation of the text. Throughout history, there are people who are literalists. Whatever you say is exactly what should be given. So your brain, your mind, is only created for explanation, التفسير وليس التأويل أو التعقل. Your brain is only used to explain things. That means you have to follow the text. In the last 3 days, 2 things happened to shed light on this contention. One of them is yesterday in the Saudi-run TV Al Arabiya, there was a title that the government refutes or refuses claims that is going to revise or cancel Hadd al-Ridda. Hadd al-Ridda means if you change your religion, you'll be killed. Your head is chopped. Because it seems that there's a rumor that because of the woman is allowed to drive, then this is going to take them into more steps, and they remove certain things that were following the text, like cutting arms and basically Hadd al-Ridda. The second thing is the Iraqi parliament next week is going to vote on several new laws in Iraq. One of them, all of them are intended to bring the rights of women back to before 1959, when the civil records law was amended in a very progressive fashion to be on the top of the other laws in the Arab countries. So what they are going to do is, the one that is in the Iraqi parliament now, is to bring the woman is allowed to get married at age 9. And the family will decide about that, not her. And the second thing is that if a woman has no children, then she will not be entitled for inheritance, to inherit the ownership from her parents. And many other items, including establishing different kinds of courts, Shia Sunnah, not just of civil records court. So these changes reflect that the retrogressive culture is still propagating very forcibly in the Arab world. When Saddam Hussein enacted Al-Hamla Al-Imaniyya, the campaign of faith in the 90s, tried to absorb some kind of movement in the society, that has triggered some repercussions. In the past, like Sadat used Muslim brothers to combat communism, but now the literal text is used. Therefore, Adonis has suggested that without total departure from the Islamic traditions, there will be no progress. Now, many people consider that as a very radical statement. Again, I'm just bringing this for discussion. Text is how much the text basically tied up our hands, preventing us from liberating the ideas. There is a مثل صيني يقول ما أنزل شفهيا لا يحق لأحد كتابته. يعني القرآن, if he came, the Quran was not kutub, it was not written. The Quran was shafahi. And then it was written, and then there are different versions, and then you find it in one Quran, and then people are using it. So things that come that way, verbally, when you write them down, you are putting them in a text. And that text can basically make your frame of mind very rigid because you have to explain. But many of you say there are so many books written about interpretations in a beautiful way of Quran and of Hadith. So that brings to my mind a very famous and expressive statement for Nietzsche. Nietzsche said that every text is open for different interpretations. And the prevalence of a specific interpretation in a specific time is a reflection, is a function of power rather than a function of truth. So how much is the power of oil has affected our ability to read the text in the oil era?
Thank you very much. Incidentally, this question of Ridda. First of all, the laws of Ridda, at least in the Ottoman domains, were removed in the 1850s, I think, right? And even Rashid Rida, before he embraced a more stringent form of Islamism, actually said that the question of Ridda is purely contextual. It was specific to a particular historical situation, which it cannot transcend, and therefore it has no relevance today. I mean, all of you would know that Quranic statements, one of the modes of interpretation is to divide statements between al-am and al-khas, the general and the specific. That is, there are certain statements which are specific to circumstances in which they arise, and therefore they have no wider applicability. And exegetes over 1400 years have debated what might be specific and what might be general. There are a number of criteria which are used. I mean, there's a huge discipline and there's a huge body of writing. But then the basic thing is that, first of all, the statement which is often made by all reasonable ulama is that Al-Quran hammal awjuh. That is to say, there are many possibilities of interpreting any given component, any given statement which is in the Quran. Incidentally, the question of orality is really not quite right, because recently we have had quite a lot of study. In fact, last spring I hosted at my university a conference on the earliest Quranic manuscripts, and these are very, very early indeed, from around the year 650, right? There are quite a number of those in Paris and St. Petersburg and in Tashkent. There's one in Mashhad in Iran. So there are extremely early texts, and we are now, in fact, in a position to at least have the main equipment, the main empirical equipment with which to reconstruct the emergence and the development of that text in the very, very early periods. Now,
So is it different than the current text?
In certain small details, nothing really substantive, but there are different orders of the surahs, for instance. There are things which are present here and not present. Certain statements which are present in some versions and not in others. So there is clearly a history of redaction and of circulation which is now open actually to reasonable, rational, historical reconstruction. And some of this work is being done, and some of this work I have done myself, and I'm still engaged in doing this. Now, the question of how relevant a text is in its literal form. Now, the first time ever that somebody used the Quran to construct a political theory as the exclusive source of a political theory was Sayyid Qutb in his exegesis, right? في ظلال القرآن. If you were to put the idea of deriving a constitutional theory, a whole theory of state, of society, of lawmaking, if you were to put that theory to a medieval alim, he will think it is absurd. Because medieval ulama were less ideological than practical. That is to say, they treated the Quran, first of all, almost never the Quran itself. Quran was always read with exegesis. It is only until actually the time of the Reformation that people thought of scripture as a stand-alone kind of object and point of inspiration. People will read the Quran for a variety of purposes. Some of them were devotional purposes, barakah and so forth. There are the ajza which are read at particular moments. There is of khatam of the text, reading it again and again for devotional purposes. But the use of the Quran in legal reasoning, for instance, in linguistic reasoning, in theological reasoning, is very limited. And it's usually governed by ideas that come from elsewhere and that use Quranic material in support of points to be sustained. This also applies to the use of the Old and the New Testaments in European history. It is also pragmatically used. Now, come the Reformation, the first motto of Luther was sola scriptura, scripture alone. Scripture alone is what governs us. That is to say, scripture stripped off its traditions. That is to say, its traditions of transmission, church authority, interpretation. We go to the raw text. And in fact, there is a case to be made, very strongly to be made. I have made this suggestion in fairly detailed forms, and others have done so as well, that Islamic reform in the late 19th century and early 20th century, like the reform of Hinduism a few decades earlier, of Buddhism at around the same time, and of various religions in East Asia as well, were in fact highly Protestantized. That is to say, imbued with ideas that had spread around from the Reformation through a variety of educational systems, through a new form of culture. The idea that scripture is a stand-alone object which we can use, and then when we read it, we can derive a social or political theory. This is something very new. It has no precedence in Muslim traditions.
Why the Quran led the initial founders of the Islamic State in Mecca and Medina? Didn't follow the Quran text?
No, of course not.
What did they do?
No, of course not.
The Prophet, what was based on?
No. The Prophet was an actor who also produced Quranic texts as he went along, right? It was a whole process over
He established a precedent.
Over 20 years. The Quran was actually it's possible now to reconstruct the way in which the Quran was circulated and used in that very early period for devotional and other purposes, but nobody thought that the Quran is actually the beginning and the end of lawmaking. It was used as a source of inspiration. The idea of a literal interpretation comes only very much later. And let us not forget that at the time of the Prophet, the Quran was still in formation. It still did not have a canonical form, which came after the Prophet's lifetime.
Information or orders? You say there are certain orders very clearly.
Yes,
Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in his speech in Mosul, he said, لا تهنوا ولا تدعوا للسلم وأنتم الأعلون. This is an order.
Absolutely. But if you look at the Quran in its, if you reorder Quranic, not just the surahs, but the ayahs, chronologically, and it is now possible to order them chronologically, despite certain empirical uncertainties, you will see precisely how the text was related to its context. So the Quran, like other scriptures, has contradictory statements, but these contradictory statements arise from circumstances. And of course, medieval exegetes said a lot about Quranic contradictions, and they had no problem with Quranic contradictions. And they did recognize that the Quran was related to its content. It is only today, with the Protestantization of Islam, which reaches its ultimate form, I suppose, in Wahhabism, right? That we have reached a point where we actually cannot approach the text with the amount of reason, with the amount of sobriety, and with the amount of public responsibility that are required in order to deal with texts of this kind. Now, let me continue. The question of this legislation that you mentioned in Iraq, of course, the legitimation of pedophilia, and the question of depriving women from inheritance if they don't bear children. Of course, depriving women of inheritance if they do not bear children has actually no foundation in fiqh. It has no foundation whatsoever. And what we must recognize is actually is to see that there are certain communities which are reconstructing themselves in a manner which, as you said, was in fact socially regressive. It's a socially regressive thing, and of course, Muslim reformers had always taken it against Europeans that, for instance, women could not. Women could not own their own wealth, as it were. That women would have needed permission from their husbands in order to dispose of their own wealth, which actually was only abolished in French law in the 1930s, right? And you would find that people like Rida and Muhammad Abdou use this polemically against Europeans at that time. Now, the point that I really want to arrive at is the following. All laws have a statute of limitation. The Arabic technical term for law used by lawyers is al-taqadum, right? And indeed, certain points in time are reached where a whole body of law might be subject to taqadum, that is to say, to a sell-by point, as it were, to exceed a sell-by point. Now, if you look at the production of Arab systems of civil law in the 1930s and 1940s, the person who actually formulated who formulated the Egyptian civil law, and then actually went on to adapt it to Syria, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Libya, was Abd al-Razak al-Sanhuri. Now, Abd al-Razak al-Sanhuri wrote a number of articles as he was actually working on Egyptian civil law. Some of the interesting things that are relevant here are the following. First of all, the preamble to that law, which incidentally is more radical in the Syrian adaptation, was that in the absence of any article of law relevant to the question at hand, one may use the general principles of Islamic jurisprudence, for which you use the word Sharia, right? The general principles, not any specific provisions. But this comes after appeal to natural justice, to principles of natural justice. That's number one. Number two, when formulating a number of regulations relating to land rent, particularly in the countryside, to the rent of land, he says that we will be using some provisions deriving from the Sharia, deriving from Islamic jurisprudence, which we will, for the purposes of these laws, consider as common law and established practice. That is to say, he severed the substantive element of law from its supposed divine origins. Because he was actually making a body of civil law. And I think that with this, we have made a crucial step ahead. But then, of course, the world is looking very different in the past 30 years. I remember just one little anecdote that Abdul Razzaq Sanhouri faced a lot of trouble in passing this law in the Egyptian parliament, particularly because of opposition from the Muslim Brothers. In Syria, it was the Minister of Justice, who was a friend of my father's, Riyad al-Midani, who was Minister of Justice under Hosni Zaim, and he brought him the text. It was signed, and Syria acquired a civil code.
Two more questions. So I'm going to reduce the next two topics into two questions. The question about sectarianism. There are two views in the Arab world about sectarianism, or not only in the Arab world, among the intellectuals, that al-Ta'ifiyya, or al-Madhhabiyya, is something that's deeply rooted in our communities 1400 years ago. The Abbasin, wal-Amawin, wal-Uthmanin, wal-Mamalik, wal-Fatimin, each consider the others infidels, and they fought each other. And so there's no end to this problem. It is deeply inscripted in the teachings of Islam and in the culture. The second thought is that for hundreds of years, and maybe longer, people lived with each other. Like Sham, Syria was predominantly Christians until the Crusaders came. No one killed them. Tadmur, Athar Tadmur were there for 1400 years. No one demolished them until ISIS. So Professor Al Azmeh gave a lecture 2 days ago about sectarianism, and he mentioned that people try to reconfigurate, draw back from present to the past. For example, in the past, you would call, this is a prime minister, this is communist, this is Ba'athist, this is a football player. Now, when you project the terminology of today, people, when they talk, so-and-so, Ara Khajadorian was an Armenian Iraqi communist. Zaki Khairi was a Sunni Iraqi communist. See what they basically project the terms of today to the past. Or if there's a team, football team, when you see, this is Shidrak Yusuf is a Christian Iraqi player, and this guy is a Shia Iraqi player. So this means that there's a lot of a truth to the fact that sectarianism, major part of it is an invention of today. Part of this is colonial, part of this is ideological, and Professor Maqdisi is in the end stages of publishing a book about sectarianism. So, briefly, do you think that sectarianism is inherited in our culture, or it is superimposed by internal and external factors currently?
Thank you very much. Incidentally, I think one thing which is liable quite often, or has been liable recently, to cause misunderstandings, misperceptions, and so forth, is related to the fact that the calamitous events through which the Arab world has been living for a couple of decades now have produced in our minds such an impression that it is very difficult to see beyond them when we look at the past. So we are tending, or many of us are tending, to paint the past in the hues of the present. And I think this is a cautionary point which I always like to apply to myself when I look at events that happened 50 years ago or 500 years ago. Am I trying to portray these events or these situations or these circumstances in the light of what I'm seeing at present, and which I can say that grieves me in the present time? So this is something which I think is needs to be highlighted all the time. It's a cautionary note that I make to myself, and it's a cautionary note that I also like to make to my interlocutors. Now, Do I think that sectarianism is inherited? No. I believe that religious denominations and other forms of community, including ethnic, have existed for a very long time. And by that I mean any form of community like this means a network of families, probably a network of locality, vested interests, lines of patronage, and so forth. That is to say, small societies, right, that have internal mechanisms of operation and mechanisms of relation to the outside. These have existed all the time. There is no society in the world which is uniform. There are always distinctions, and these distinctions are always invariably accompanied by various degrees of either derisive or negative or any other kinds of regards towards the others. This is very well expressed in jokes that people make about other collectivities, right? So there are views of theirs. However, in a situation of sectarianism, these casual preconceptions, prejudices, call them what you may, come to play a predominant role. I did refer in that lecture, and I'd like to bring this again. There has recently been published in France by a well-known academic and public intellectual called Didier Eribon, a study of a working class community in the city of Reims in the north of France. Now, he traces the way in which the community in which he was born, which is a very working class, industrial working class community, how it made a transition from simply casual distrust of outsiders with different color of skin into a systemic and self-sustaining racism on a daily basis, highly ideologized, which sustains the National Front. This is the electorate of the National Front. Now, this particular electorate used to vote en bloc communists. He describes this transition very well. Now, there is no denying that there are social distinctions, and of course, distinctions of denomination can also be professional. For instance, in Damascus, most jewelers are Christians, for example, Orthodox Christians from the center of the city. And there are certain specializations of this kind which are inherited and which of course change over time. But there are also particular attitudes, not necessarily friendly, towards outsiders, which actually do not hamper, under ordinary circumstances, do not hamper proper social interaction on a daily basis. So I consider these and various inflections, slight differences in dress, in accent, in body language, quite a number of things that are crucial to the way we identify each other, right, when we see each other on the street or when we talk to each other. These are very tiny inflections in a culture which is in fact very uniform. If you look, for instance, at the way in which weddings are celebrated, if you look at cuisine, quite a number of other things, and general attitudes towards things. So within that commonality, which arises from a common history over hundreds of years, there are small distinctions. Now, in situations where you have state disintegration and state atrophy with no sustaining core, political core, and no sustaining body politic, you find that these civil or pre-civil communal ties of security, with my brother and my cousins, right? Ties that betoken security in a situation of uncertainty, they become inordinately important. Much more important than in a situation where society and the state and the economy actually functioned. When you have state atrophy, and when you have disintegration, when you have fragmentation on a geographical basis, for instance, then of course these things acquire a surfeit of importance. And then they become decisive. Once they become decisive, they become central for the actors and they become self-sustaining. They acquire an internal dynamic. So, sectarianism is not inherited. Difference is inherited, but sectarianism is not.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Before we open the floor for a few questions, I know you got tired and it has taken more than an hour. I'm going to transform Professor Al Azmeh from a historian to a fortune teller. I'm going to ask him the most difficult question. I'll give him only, even what makes it worse, only 2 minutes to answer this question. This is about Syria. What makes, things are not very as simple as these are radicals and these have bad ideologies. When thousands and thousands of youth, and including Christian youth, transform into Islam and go to our part of the world to fight, 60, 70,000 people, according to the CIA and according to Turkish intelligence. These people, they must have seen something that makes sense for them to go and fight there. And they have recruited thousands and thousands of people. It started in Iraq after the American invasion. They went to Syria, and now in Sinai, in Africa, all around the world. In order to find a solution, you have to understand this phenomena. And to understand it, you have to deconstruct it to its main elements. It's not enough to say these are just people are misled people. They need rehabilitation. What are the main factors? I know people talk about despotism, about poor economy, outside support, all these things. Lack of alternatives, lack of jobs, exclusion in Europe, ghettos. So the question is, A, what are the major forces that made this possible? And B, how do you see the situation in Syria 5 years from now? I know you are not a fortune teller, but I have to ask this question. You have 2 minutes and 30 seconds.
I will give you an answer to it. First of all, the question of recruitment. The question of recruitment to Al-Qaeda or Daesh, right?
Or all the other Islamic.
Yes, the question of recruitment has a number of elements. It's a very heterogeneous body of people who join. Those who join from outside. Now, those who have gone, we know that those who have gone from England, for instance, some of them, a small number actually, have had religious commitments. The others tended to buy this book, Islam for Dummies, right? I mean, they have absolutely no idea. They learn to pray when they get down there. Basically, they go for the ride. This is an extremely exciting, very masculine, testosterone-driven organization. They go for the excitement. They go for the excitement from situations which of social anomie in quite a number of elements that arise. I mean, you did mention unemployment, exclusion, and so forth, and you mentioned it somehow derisively. I think it is primary. I think this is primary. This actually softens people up and makes them receptive for wanting actually to go for that drive and to be real men with guns and the capacity to kill with impunity. And in this sense, there is quite a lot to be said for comparisons that are being said about being made, and I've seen some of these, and some of them are very convincing, about the way the mechanisms of bonding among these and the mechanisms of bonding in gangland. Right? These are very, very important matters which should not be treated derisively. To this, religion becomes secondary, but then it becomes primary once they get in and they get into the loop. But that is not the motivating factor, not the motivating factor necessarily. The local recruits, for instance, now that Daesh has lost Al-Raqqa, we do know that locals have blended back, and they had adhered for a number of very local reasons. Number of very local reasons. Daesh always made arrangements with particular positions of authority in the areas which it dominated, and then it became overpowering. People came in from that avenue, alliances, communal alliances. Secondly, let us not forget that militias are large-scale employers. Militias are large-scale employers, and I don't think that this is something which can be taken very lightly. This is an extremely important and crucial element in recruitment. People then get socialized into the ways of thinking of Al-Qaeda and of Daesh. This is not something which brings people in. This is something which people acquire when they are inside. In many cases, it disappears or it evaporates once they're out. In other cases, it really then, if they are properly inducted, then they will be remotivated. Syria in 5 years' time, I have no idea. I'm sorry.
I know. It's a very hard question. But yeah, that's a very unique insight about the primary cause of recruitment and the secondary cause. You can read كتاب إدارة التوحش, Abu Bakr. It gives you the Bible. It is a revealing book about policies, إدارة التوحش. And now I'm going to open the floor for a few questions, and I'm very sorry that our time, especially because many of you have commitments in the evenings, but I'd like to open the floor for maybe 5 questions, and maybe you expect short answers so that we can take more questions. Tawfiq?
There are other factors, external factors, that have played on sectarianism in the Middle East. I can tell you from a Lebanese perspective that it has been, at least since the early, probably 19th century with the Ottoman and then the French and then Israel, these external powers have played into the sectarianism in Lebanon. In recent one in Iraq, we have Joe Biden, the vice president at the time, mentioned clearly that we want 3 different states in Iraq, the Sunnis and the Shias and the Kurds. In Syria, I mean, the examples go on and on. How much of it is external and how much of it is internal, in your opinion?
You know, my view is the following. I place I think, appropriate emphasis on agency. These things do not simply emerge by themselves. There are actors which make them possible. There are actors who sustain them, and there are actors who take them further. Now, external action is doubtless. It's very evident. The idea of splitting up the Middle East in the 19th century was a standard idea used by quite a number of colonial administrators. In the case of Lebanon, it became actually a system first of administration and then of the building of polity, which of course persists until today. So yes, agency is crucially important. In the case of Iraq, for instance, I was able to witness. I've given a couple of examples. Dr. Aziz heard them, of the way in which people in the early 1990s started reconfiguring the very idea of Iraq along these lines. And this was, of course, something which had been sustained by, I think in largest measure, by US neoconservatives. We all know who was active in Washington and what kinds of organizations were made and what kind of expectations there were when the Americans invaded in the first instance, what kinds of ideas they came with. So yes, this is very, very important. But of course, in order for these to be possible, then we have to be complicit. And those of us who, and these things would not have been, these policies would never have been implemented had there not been people who were not only complicit, but some of the Iraqis in Washington actually formulated these policies, right? We all know them, we all know who they are and how they acted. I'm told by good friends who from the Syrian opposition who were meeting with Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, that she was always that the only model that she had in her mind of Syrian polity is that of coalition of religions and ethnicities. It's the idea of civility, the idea of citizenship, irrespective of religion, denomination, of ethnicity, was not something which she was actually able to grasp at all.
Second question, let me see. تفضل.
You mentioned something about the Quran. And the Quran came to civilize the human behavior. And a lot of things that came in the Quran, like the zakah, like the things that you do, okay, the things that you do that makes you a better person, like don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, is zakah. Like, I want to give you an example of myself. There is the ayah, وَأَمَّا السَّائِلَ فَلَا تَنْهَرْ. Somebody called me, an Iraqi called me, I met him once in Jordan. I don't know him. And he asked me to send him some money. He's in Florida because he has 3 kids and wife and he doesn't have any money. I really don't want to send him money, but when I read the ayah, وَأَمَّا السَّائِلَ لَا تَنْهَرْ, I said, I have to send it. So I send him the money today. What's wrong with Islam, I think, is that ما في اجتهاد جديد. يعني there is no scholars to come in ويجتهدوا في الإسلام. وبعدين وضع المسلمين as Shia and Sunni, that really brought a strain on the Islam and the relation. I was raised, don't know anything about Shia, because in Palestine there is no Shia. I didn't know there is Shia existed till I was in college. So is the Shia, I think it's a little more extreme, like Dr. Aziz said, that they're going back to allowing girls to marry when they are 9 years and other things that they do. I think don't you think our problem is 2 things: modernizing the Islam and bring those scholars to translate the Islam to fit our time, and the second thing, education. I think our education system is lacking, and we need to work on that.
Yeah, I'm going to answer this question. The lecture, really, the discussion is not about your use of your religion to reform yourself. No one will tell you. Not many people use religion to be better people. This is the best use of religion, as a matter of fact. The problem comes when you impose your religion on others and use it against others and discriminate between others because they don't do this, they don't do that. And that is very clear in Sharia, that is used by many people, that if you don't think that Salah is a duty, kafir. Al-kafir yustatab, ba'd 3 ayyam yuqtal. So it doesn't have to mean Islam itself, but the way people read Islam. So if you read Islam as a reforming power for yourself, that's the best thing. Now, regarding in Iraq, the new law, I know probably you think in Iraq, al-Hukuma Shi'iyya, that's why they enacted this, they are going to discuss this law. No, the marriage, the limit of marriage in 9 years, this is both common to Shia and Sunni jurisprudence. They think يقتدون بنبيهم الصالح والسلف الصالح. And they think that Nabi got married from Aisha at 9 years, whether that's right or wrong. They think this is the right thing to do. And this is not only in Iraq. If you go to the Madhab al-Maliki, Shafi'i, al-Hanafi, al-Hanbali. Now, so 3 more questions. 1 second, let me, تفضل لطيف.
In the middle of the debate of Islam, Deen and Dawla, Moroccan thinker Abdullah Al-Arwi came up with a very provocative book from its title, Sunnah wal-Islah. In this book, he invites for another outlook again to the Islamic society, how it starts. He came back with 2 distinguished elements: Islam Nufus and Islam Al-Afaq. Islam Mecca and Islam Medina. And he took the word Medina literally as state, driven from Jean-Jacques Rousseau's understanding of the world. Basically, Abdullah Al-Arwi was highlighting one important point, which is that secular attitude was a matter of behavior of Al-Hakim. Muawiyah, when he took the capital from Medina to Damascus, he started the first experience of Arab secularism. Going back to another region of the Islamic world, And this time I'm going to have my foundation of another Moroccan thinker, Abd al-Jabri, the idea of sectarianism. For example, Jabri mentions something very important in his book Al-Aql al-Arabi, that matters of kalam, of debate between Shia and Sunnah, for example, they were solved in a matter of discussion. The same matter is solved in terms of killing and beheading in Asfahan. So don't you say, Dr. Adma, that sometimes sectarianism or secularism can be studied from anthropological standpoint, not geopolitical one?
Just one word is that if there was a statement in one of the books that I read, say, because many people brought up this Muawiyah can secular. If Muawiyah was secular, he said then Trump was communist. It is as diverse as it is. But I will let Professor Azmeh answer.
Absolutely, I would agree entirely. I mean, this is a very common myth that, in the common mind, and of course in historical scholarship as well, that there is a kind of secularization of state authority with the Umayyads and so forth. Which, of course, let's not forget that Muawiyah and all the other Khulafa were Khulafa Allah. Right? This is not a secular idea that they are Khulafa Allah. This is not a secular idea at all.
How he ran the state. How he ran the state. Byzantium scholars.
He ran the state like everybody else runs the state, right? Somehow more adroitly than others, perhaps, but he ran the state as everybody has run a state before him and after him until today. Running a state has a number. I mean, there is an art to running a state. He was good at that art, and nobody can run a state without acquiring and implementing this particular art. So no, I don't think that there was this model of interpretation and indeed of narrating history is in conformity with the facts that we know. The distinction between Islam Mecca and Islam Medina, Abdullah Al-Arwi is incidentally, to my mind, an Arab thinker of extraordinary importance. I know him personally. Rather well. We have over the years discussed quite a number of matters. I have great regard for him, and I'm actually quite surprised that he, this is of course a very late work of his, that he actually came up with such a schematic distinction, which is incidentally out of keeping with the intellectual rigor that he usually exercises.
And that's really out of Abdullah. Will not take more questions from you, but Abdullah Al-Arwi initial writings really were totally out of this contention. This is only in the last 10 years he started talking about that. Mafhum al-Hurriya li Abdullah Al-Arwi is one of the books that really you need to read it. Abdullah Al-Arwi is a very important contributor to the Arab intelligence. Dr. Rizq.
شكرا للعزيزين على هيك محاضرة. We enjoyed it. My question is about the term non-religious. And I'm not sure if we can equate the word or the term non-religious with the term secularism. And I just want to give you one example, from like Jordan. 2 years ago, during the parliament election, a group of progressive candidates came up with an agenda, and they started promoting the الدولة المدنية, the civil state. They were immediately attacked by the Muslim Brotherhood and even by the candidates who are basically supported by the government. And they accused them, this means, non-religious, secularism means non-religious, which means socialism and communism. And, of course, they use that, because they want to, undermine their candidate. So can you help us untangle, these terms, and if we can really equate the non-religious term with the secularism?
Thank you very much. This is an important. But incidentally, I omitted just a little remark on what the gentleman here in front said. The question of the moral injunctions that you are referring to, the ethical injunctions that you are referring to, are actually, I mean, to my mind, they are moral, ethical injunctions which exist in the Quran, but they are also moral injunctions which are in conformity with human moral consciousness in any case. So this is a point that I really would like to make in this particular regard. Now, listen, the idea of there was very little. The issue of secularism and the use of the word. You know, I spoke earlier of implicit secularization, objective secularization, without this having been ideologized or made into deliberate policy and into well-articulated policy. It became secularism as such and circulated in the public sphere under a very negative signature in a huge body of anti-secular polemics which emerged in the 1960s and 1970s. These were, again, the question of agency. These were very deliberately promoted, extremely well financed, institutionally anchored, by bodies that had been constructed under the signature of the organization of the Islamic Conference and its predecessors, and as part actually of the Cold War effort to promote religion as the cultural part of the Cold War. That is to say, the religion, and most particularly the Muslim religion, is to be used as a counterpoint to communism, socialism, Nasserism, Baathism, and so forth. There was a huge body of polemical literature. I've read quite a lot of it, much of it produced in Saudi Arabia, much of it also published in Beirut, in a particular publishing house which was owned by a member of the Syrian Muslim Brothers called Dar al-Jadid. So this is actually where I've always maintained that the issue of secularism as such and as a contentious element is something which has been contrived by religious, social conservatives in the context of the Cold War. Since then, this has taken a life of its own because a number of institutions, very well-funded institutions, had been built up in order to sustain these ideas, and this is part of the international process of Islamization and the spreading of a particular form of Islamic belief and practice internationally. So basically it is a term in a polemic.
Just to have more information about this topic, about the use of the Western power to enact certain forms of religion, there are two books for George Qaram, the Lebanese thinker, who last week won an award, the Ben Awais Award in Economy. The first book, I think in 2007, is called المسألة الإسلامية في القرن العشرين. It's in French, translated to Arabic, and I'm not sure if it is present in English. The second book is استخدام النزاعات الدولية, استخدام الدين في النزاعات الدولية. And he gives you all the evidence about the American support to both Christian and Islamic religious groups to combat communism, and how they use different countries like Saudi Arabia to enforce that. One more question, Dr. Touma, did you have a question? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Now that we have the diagnosis and we acknowledge that we have problem, what is your suggestion for the remedy of these things? What can be done on the level of the leaders or on the level of the people? What they should do to go back to our values in the 50s and 60s?
Well, I mean, it's not a question of necessarily going back to the values of the 50s and 60s, which, of course, we might romanticize that period. But of course, history is a one-way street. It's vectorial. It doesn't really return. But there are a number of universal values which were implicated at that time and which are cherished by many of us. And I think the situation has worsened so much. Societies have changed so radically and in ways which are not necessarily praiseworthy. the only thing that I can suggest, me as an ordinary actor who has no institutional locations or institutional power, is to actually speak with clarity. To speak with clarity when we write, when we speak in a meeting of this kind, in educational institutions, with the emphasis on education, of course, has always been with us. And the emphasis on education is something which is valid, really, for all times. If we are to develop in ways which are promising and which promise the best for us, then there are political preconditions which, in the Mashriq at least at the moment, do not obtain. But I am pretty optimistic about Tunisia and Morocco, for instance, where these matters have been treated with a much greater degree of sobriety and rationality.
Well, I would like to thank our guest, Professor Aziz Al Azmeh, and I apologize for not being able to take more questions because it has been more than 2 hours and many of you have commitments. But I hope that this engagement will continue, and stay tuned for more activities originated from Rice and University of Houston. And we have so many intellectuals in this community that we are thankful. We are learning from them, and I have learned, and I hope that you have learned something from this conversation. And thank you, and have a good evening.